and
okay.
So I cordially welcome all of you again, together with my co-host, Rabbi Dr. Ben Scolnic. And this is now the 7th edition of our Seleukid lecture series, which we are going to start with a real highlight. I have the greatest pleasure to introduce Kathy Lorber to you, our speaker today, but well, it is carrying owls to Athens to introduce her to a Seleukid audience, because she is, amongst others, co-editor of the most important coin catalog, co-edited together with Arthur Houghton and Oliver Hoover. And she is, well, she's qualified for her talk today in so many ways, also as the editor of the most important catalog on Ptolemaic coinage. Though while I would love to say and show you both of the catalogs behind me in my bookshelf, I can only show you the Houghton Lorber edition of the Seleukid coins, because the Ptolemaic coins were published in such a low edition that it's very difficult to get hold of them. But it's also a testimony to the high authority and appreciation that Kathy is enjoying that these books sold out. And she mentioned to me some time ago that soon there will be a second edition, which we are all looking forward to. Now, there is a lot of flattering that you would normally hear in such introductions, and it's difficult how I can top that for someone as important and dear to me as Kathy. I personally can easily say that she is the most important ancient numismatist to me, and that is not just because of her published work, but I can think of no one who is so accessible, so generous with her time. And I think many of us in the audience already know her through their personal interactions with her, because she's always there to support, to give advice. And that is quite a model of scholarship. So we are pleased in so many ways to have you with us today, Kathy. And we are going to learn from you today about Ptolemaic influence in Seleukid Judah through Tobiad agency and money. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Altay, and thank you, Ben, also for giving me the opportunity to present what I hope is my last report on a topic that's engaged me for over a decade. I'd like to dedicate my talk to the memory of Andreas Blasius, a beloved colleague from the University of Bonn, whom Altay also knew, who died unexpectedly just a little over a year ago. One of his academic specialties was the rivalry between Ptolemy VI and the Seleucids. Now for the lecture. Ptolemaic interests profoundly influenced life in 2nd century Judah. For a time, this influence was exercised through the Tobiad family, who were originally warm supporters of Ptolemaic rule. As is well known, the Tobiads controlled ancestral lands in the Ammanitis and commanded a colony of cavalry clerics, first attested textually under Ptolemy II. We can reasonably assume that these cavalrymen were deployed to protect Ptolemaic interests in the Transjordan. They were surely deployed during the Fourth Syrian War. They would be the Ptolemaic troops who pillaged the land of the Arabs to punish them for supporting Antiochus III, to which the king responded by attacking and capturing their headquarters at Rabbi, Philadelphia. I shall argue later in this lecture that the Tobiad cavalrymen were also mobilized during the Fifth Syrian War, and that they succeeded in limiting Seleukid conquests east of the Jordan. Monetary policies of the Ptolemaic and Seleukid kings also played a role in the history of Judah in the 2nd century. I've treated these policies in several recent publications. My focus here will be to to try to integrate the implications of those studies with new insights into the activities of the Tobiads and new numismatic discoveries. In 1995, Georges Lorider demonstrated that the closed monetary zone created by the Ptolemies in Syria and Phoenicia remained in place under Antiochus III, so that Ptolemaic silver coinage remained the only silver coinage in circulation. Royal Seleukid silver coinage, which adhered to the heavier Attic weight standard, did not circulate in the monetary zone. Thus, the currency continued to advertise the prestige and sovereignty of the Ptolemies, contrary to the new reality, whereas Seleukid self-representation was limited to low-value bronze coinage. Lorider justified retention of the closed monetary zone as consistent with established Seleukid policy of tolerating foreign currency. Alain Bresson, in his recent SLS lecture on Seleukid wealth, characterized the failure to coin foreign specie as an administrative weakness, perhaps attributable to parsimony. As I've repeatedly pointed out, Antiochus III and his sons had other options of which they did not avail themselves. They struck no silver on a reduced weight standard that could circulate in their new province. They did not even resort to the simple and cost-effective expedient of countermarking Ptolemaic coinage with some symbol of Seleukid sovereignty, so as to legitimize it as Seleukid currency and advertise their own sovereignty. We're left in the dark about the financing of the Seleukid military and provincial administrations. Did they really pay state employees with money that advertised Ptolemaic kingship? One alternative is that they used some combination of bronze coinage, payments in kind, and cashless accounting. Another possibility, not exclusive of the others, is that some salaries were credited in Attic weight Seleukid coinage, which could not actually circulate in Seleukid Coeli, Syria and Phoenicia. Scholars have speculated about the motives for retaining the closed monetary zone, but it seems that we can reject the most anodyne explanations, a desire not to disrupt economic life, or a desire to keep trade with the Ptolemaic kingdom. The Israel Antiquities Authority maintains a database of all coins found in excavations in Israel. Donald Ariel and I consulted the database in September 2017 to identify the flow of Ptolemaic coinage into 2nd century Judah. To my great surprise, we found that virtually no new Ptolemaic coinage entered the closed monetary zone between the end of the 5th Syrian War and 170. Of the identifiable coins of Ptolemy 5th and 6th in the database at that time, only 2 were undoubtedly struck in this time frame. Both era tetradrachms, or tetradrachms of an uncertain era, one dated to era year 89, equivalent to 174.3 BCE, and the other dated year N90, equivalent to 173.2 BCE. In 2017, I was unaware that there was a separate database maintained by the Staff Officer for Archaeology in Judea and Samaria. I inquired recently and learned that it's no longer accessible. As a proxy, I supplement the information from the IAA database with the finds from the Mount Gerizim excavations. Alongside 8 bronze coins of Antiochus III, datable after 198, and 6 bronze coins of Seleucus IV, the database of the finds included 6 Ptolemaic tetradrachms, of which only 1 was datable, certainly datable to this period. Another era tetradrachm, this time of year 91, whose date is equivalent to 17270 BC, excuse me, 17271 BCE. Between the IAA database and the Mount Gerizim finds, we can document the entry of only 3 Ptolemaic silver coins, all of them era tetradrachms, into the closed monetary zone between the Seleukid conquest and 170. The absence of meaningful flows of new Ptolemaic silver could hardly be incidental. We have to assume an official ban on the importation of new Ptolemaic coinage. This could hardly have helped commercial activity or encouraged trade with the Ptolemaic realm. The hoard record is also peculiar. No silver hoards were deposited in the southern Levant from the end of the 5th Syrian War until the late 170s. A hoard from Jericho with a closing date of 174-3, seen on the coin market in 2016 and 2018, is the 3rd largest Hellenistic hoard from the Syro-Phoenician region. A second hoard from Jordan, seen in 2013, closed in 172-71, and a published hoard from the Jericho area, closed in 171-70. A new generation of coin hoards began to be deposited in the 160s. These later hoards lack the older Ptolemaic coinage of the 3rd century that's present in all of the hoards of the late 170s. The complete disappearance of all older silver coinage could hardly have been accomplished by fiat right around 170. Such a thorough disappearance must have required a process that continued over several years at a minimum. These considerations incline me to accept the main elements of Flavius Josephus' account of Tobiad tax farming. Despite its troubling chronological inconsistencies, interpolation of anachronistic events, and fanciful claims. The numismatic evidence from Israel provides a strong basis for dating the tax farming activity of Joseph, son of Tobias, to the 2nd century, as implied by Josephus' mentions of Queen Cleopatra, and not to the 3rd century, as assumed by many historians. It's not my intention here to revisit the scholarly debate over Josephus' Tobiad romance. I'll simply review the elements that I consider credible. First is the grant of Phoenicia, Syria, Samaria, and Judah as the dowry of Cleopatra I upon her engagement to the young Ptolemy V. This dowry is also mentioned by Appian and Porphyry. Josephus' text immediately makes it clear that the dowry was not a territorial gift, but a sharing of revenues between Antiochus III and his son-in-law. A second element I consider largely credible is the account of the tax farming auction in Alexandria, which betrays some knowledge of how such auctions were conducted. According to Josephus, Joseph, son of Tobias, won the exclusive right to collect taxes for Ptolemy V in the whole of Syria, Phoenicia, Judah, and Samaria. At least some of the taxes involved must have been money taxes, which would have been rendered in Ptolemaic precious metal coinage, the only high-value coinage circulating in the province, and the only coinage acceptable to the Ptolemaic king. The annual collection of taxes in Ptolemaic money, combined with the ban on importing fresh coinage, must have greatly reduced the supply of precious metal coinage in Syria and Phoenicia, especially in the more urbanized coastal regions. This can explain the lack of hoards west of the Jordan and Jericho, and the disappearance of older silver coinage by 170. It also explains the joke of Ptolemy's court jester that Joseph, son of Tobias, had picked Syria clean as a pile of bones, offered on the occasion of a mission to Alexandria court by Joseph's youngest son Hyrcanos in 186, after the birth of the Ptolemaic royal heir. Finally, I credit Josephus' twice mentioned claim that Joseph, son of Tobias, collected the taxes of Syria, Phoenicia, and Samaria for 22 years. The span of 22 years corresponds to the time between the earliest fiscal year after the marriage of Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I, that is, the fiscal year 193-2, and a final year of tax farming in 172-1, shortly before the outbreak of the Sixth Syrian War, and shortly before Antiochus IV repudiated the dowry of Cleopatra I. This chronology leaves no time for Hyrcanos, youngest son of Joseph, son of Tobias, to have been Joseph's successor in tax farming, as assumed by some scholars, including Lester Graba and Fawzi Zayedin. 2 Maccabees 3:11 describes an attempt by Heliodorus, prime minister of Seleucus IV, to seize 400 talents of silver and 200 talents of gold from the temple at Jerusalem, some of it belonging to Hyrcanos the Tobiad. Maurice Sartre, followed by Sylvie Honigman, interpreted the tale as evidence that Hyrcanos was engaged in farming the taxes, and that he used the temple as a temporary repository for the revenues before forwarding them to Alexandria. Michael Girardin examined a proposition offered by Martin Hengel and repeated by Edouard Will and Claude Orieux, that all the taxes due the Ptolemaic kings were deposited permanently in the Jerusalem temple. Ultimately, Girardin decided that the Ptolemaic kings were more likely to want the revenues securely under their own control. This rather self-evident conclusion is supported by Josephus, who reports that Joseph, son of Tobias, instructed his Alexandrian agent Arion to deliver the taxes to the king. The interpretation of the Heliodorus episode in light of tax farming by Hyrcanos may be correct, but it goes beyond the evidence otherwise available to us. Josephus states only that that Hyrcanos obliged the barbarians at Transjordan to pay their taxes. The context of Josephus' statement is the time following a violent quarrel between Hyrcanos and his half-brothers after Hyrcanos' mission to the Alexandrian court. The older sons of Joseph, son of Tobias, attacked their sibling. Hyrcanos killed 2 of his half-brothers, then fled across the Jordan. Josephus states that Joseph, son of Tobias, secretly approved the attack of his older sons on the Hyrcanos because he disapproved of the lavish spending of Hyrcanos in Alexandria. But he concealed his true emotions because of the high standing Hyrcanos enjoyed with Ptolemy V. When the assassination attempt failed, Joseph, son of Tobias, must have resumed cooperative relations with Hyrcanos. It was probably at this point, i.e. in 186 or shortly after, that Joseph enrolled Hyrcanos as a metokos, or partner, in the tax farming enterprise. We've only recently understood that a well-known class of imitative Ptolemaic tetradrachms, not counterfeits but coins of good silver, stemmed from a mint in Ammanitis. This mint was surely under the authority of the Tobiads. Its production extended over several decades, beginning in the late 3rd century. It may have struck its first coinage during the 4th Syrian War. It was intensely active during the 5th Syrian War. A few imitations have been identified in 4 hoards deposited at the end of the 5th Syrian War, and the patterns of die linkage indicate the use of multiple anvils in their production. The assumption is that the imitative coinage paid for Tobiad military operations during the war, presumably in the Transjordan. Josephus, quoting Polybius, states that after the Battle of Panion, Antiochus III gained Batanea, Abila, and Gadara. All three of these are located east of the Jordan, but north of the Tobiad domain. It appears that Tobiad forces ultimately limited Seleukid expansion in the Transjordan. The Tobiad mint continued to strike episodic issues of imitative tetradrachms during the first decades of the 2nd century. This phase of coinage required 67 obverse dies, of which 7 had already been used in the 3rd century. The 60 new dies, assuming an average productivity of 20,000 coins per die, could have struck as much as 800 talents of coined silver. The end of this mint activity is apparently attributable to the capture of the fortified Tobiad stronghold at Iraq al-Amir by Antiochus IV, probably in 169. We don't know the specific purpose of all the Tobiad coin issues, but at least some must have be related to the construction of the palace at Iraq al-Amir, or the improvement of the associated defensive installations in a network of caves. The coinage also doubtless funded the troops employed by Hyrcanos to collect taxes from the barbarians and to conduct perpetual war on his Arab neighbors. Imitative tetradrachms of the Tobiad mint are found in hoards mainly from Ammanitis, eastern Judah, and Cyprus. The Cypriot provenances suggest some avenue of cooperation or coordination between the Tobiads and Ptolemaic Cyprus. This impression is heightened by the circulation pattern of an enigmatic coinage minted on Cyprus under Ptolemy V and VI. The second phase of the so-called coinage of an uncertain era consists of tetradrachms in the name of Ptolemy Soter, with era dates ranging from 70 to 92, corresponding to the years 193-2 to 170 BCE. We have good evidence that this coinage was struck on Cyprus. Julien Olivier determined that its metallic signature was identical to that of regular Ptolemaic coinage from Cyprus, and Eric Carlin identified an obverse die that had previously been used at Salamis. Yet only 13 specimens have been recorded in Cypriot coin hoards, as opposed to 81 in hoards from Jordan and 12 in a hoard from the Jericho area. The massing of Cypriot coinage in Ammanitis over the early decades of the 2nd century must surely be significant. Unfortunately, we don't know what sorts of transactions lay behind this movement of currency. Did the Ptolemaic state use it to purchase spices and oriental luxuries from the Nabatean Arabs, but because of its chronic shortage of silver, use Cypriot coinage to pay? Did the Ptolemaic state pay a subsidy to the Tobiads? Recently, Eric Carlin offered an ingenious hypothesis. He noted that the dates of the 2nd phase era coinage correspond closely to those I calculated for the tax farming career of Joseph, son of Tobias. Carlin inferred that the 2nd phase era coinage was a special purpose currency related to tax farming. Its function was money changing, to convert the proceeds of agricultural produce sold on the international market for adequate silver to Ptolemaic weight coinage, which could then be sent to Alexandria, where foreign coinage was excluded. The pooling of this coinage in Ammanitis reflects the role of the Tobiads as tax farmers for Ptolemy V and VI, and represents profits that accrued to them. Beginning in era year 86, equivalent to 177.6, each annual issue of the second phase era coinage exhibits a different style. Such a pattern is found nowhere else in Ptolemaic coinage. It suggests that coin production was contracted out to at least 2 private workshops. We may well imagine that the tax farmers managed the contracting process. It was, after all, their obligation to convert the taxes they collected into acceptable specie. If this interpretation is correct, for a time there were 2 mints under Tobiad control. A final claim of Josephus is worthy of our consideration, that Joseph, son of Tobias, made a great fortune from his tax farming and used his profits both to cement his own authority and to lift the Judahites out of a state of weakness and poverty to a more splendid style of life. The mention of Josephus' magnanimity suggests that he acted as a benefactor to his community in the usual manner of Hellenistic elites. But we should also bear in mind that tax farming for all the different taxes of the Syro-Phoenician region would have required a fairly large staff. Andrew Monson envisioned a hierarchy of subcontractors, hypotelones, similar to arrangements attested in Egypt. Such a hierarchy would have spread the profits of tax farming throughout a segment of the Judahite elite. In addition, tax farmers required protection in the course of their duties. Apart from the first year, when Joseph, son of Tobias, was protected by infantry borrowed from Ptolemy V, he probably employed Judahite guards because the Tobiad cavalry were occupied with parallel duties in the Transjordan. Judahites working in the tax farming enterprise would have been well aware that their income and status stemmed from serving the Ptolemaic king. The Ptolemaic sympathies of Joseph, his associates, and his admirers probably weakened Seleukid control over Judah in the years of Joseph's local preeminence. Histories of Judah in this period often posit opposing pro-Seleukid and pro-Ptolemaic factions. Some authors, for example, Fawzi Zayadin, assert that the pro-Seleukid party emerged immediately after the conquest by Antiochus III in response to the benefactions presented in the so-called Charter of Alexandria, preserved in Josephus' Jewish Antiquities. In fact, this was a conventional document following a precedent set by the Achaemenids. The Judahite response was also conventional. Ceremonies of welcome were standard for surrendering cities to avoid looting, massacres, and enslavement. Judahite aid to Antiochus III should not be interpreted as warm and lasting support for Seleukid rule. As for an eventual emergence of a pro-Seleukid party, I'm skeptical. The sources provide instances of individuals who approached a Seleukid king or officials in pursuit of their own career prospects or to punish enemies. This shows no particular devotion to Seleukid rule. A party of Antiochus IV is mentioned only once as admitting him to Jerusalem on the occasion of his first attack in 169. But 2 other accounts of the same attack say he took the city by storm. So if there was a pro-Seleukid party, it emerged only in the context of open warfare. Still, we should not assume universal admiration for Joseph, son of Tobias, or general agreement with his dynastic preference. It seems clear that his conspicuous good fortune provoked jealousy in some quarters and contributed to a dissolution of social cohesion, so that Judahite elites competed ruthlessly for advantage and refused to accept the leadership of others. The feud within the Tobiad family is a vivid illustration. Another example is the Heliodorus episode. It occurred because Simon of the tribe of Benjamin, overseer of the temple, denounced the high priest Onias and advised that the king confiscate money from the temple treasury. Subsequently, Simon blamed Onias for inciting Heliodorus to raid the temple, and even had murders committed by his agents. Evidently, Judahite society was already suffering from vicious rivalries, even under the reign of Seleukid IV. The geopolitical situation changed dramatically around 170. The ministers of the young Ptolemy VI attempted an invasion of the Seleukid kingdom. Antiochus IV crushed the threat. Then he repudiated the dowry of Cleopatra first, and soon after invaded Egypt. He withdrew for the winter and invaded for a second time in the following spring, but was compelled to withdraw by the Roman envoy L. Opilius Linus in the famous day of Eleusis. In SE 143, essentially equivalent to 169 BCE, between his first and second invasions of Egypt, Antiochus attacked Jerusalem, though we also have some reason to date this attack a year later. It was probably in the course of this campaign by which he subdued the Tobiad stronghold in Iraq al-Amir, resulting in the suicide of Hyrcanos. Jewish literary sources relate the attack on Jerusalem to a violent conflict over the high priesthood by Jason, a deposed high priest, and his successor Onias, also called Menelaus. From the Ptolemaic point of view, these troubles in Judah were a welcome development. They opened a second front in the Sixth Syrian War and forced the Seleukid king to divide his attention. I offer the hypothesis that disorders in Jerusalem were deliberately fomented to aid Ptolemaic interests, and that some Tobiads and their money played a leading role. The three surviving narratives about the troubles in Jerusalem differ in certain key details and cannot be fully reconciled. But two of them feature Tobiad agency, and the third features large sums of money and Ammanitis. According to Josephus in Jewish Antiquities 12-239-247, sometime before the invasion of Egypt by Antiochus IV, the former high priest Jason raised a rebellion against Menelaus, who was supported by the sons of Tobias. When Jason prevailed, Menelaus and the sons of Tobias fled to King Antiochus and petitioned him for permission to found a gymnasium in Jerusalem and introduce other Hellenizing reforms and reject Jewish law. Subsequently, Antiochus invaded Egypt. In 169, he advanced on Jerusalem, was admitted by his supporters, killed many of the opposing party, and plundered the city. Confusingly, Josephus places these events after Antiochus was dismissed from Egypt by the Romans, but he also provides an absolute date derived from 1st Maccabees. In the Jewish War 131-34, Josephus refers to a serious rebellion in Judah during the quarrel between Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI. It involved intense competition among Jewish elites and a victory of the high priest Onias, who drove the sons of Tobias out of Jerusalem. The sons of Tobias repaired to Antiochus and entreated him to make them his leaders and to attack Jerusalem. He took Jerusalem by storm and massacred his opponents, who are explicitly identified as supporters of Ptolemy. The sons of Tobias referenced in both of Josephus' narratives must, in view of the chronological context, be the older sons of Joseph the Tobiad and the inimical half-brothers of Hyrcanos. Their hostility toward the supporters of Ptolemy represents a change in the family's traditional loyalties, resulting from the family feud that broke out after Hyrcanos' mission to Alexandria. It's easy to imagine that the sons of Tobias recommended the attack on Hyrcanos, as well as the attack on Jerusalem and its Ptolemaic adherents. The account in 2 Maccabees 4:7 to 5:7 is an obviously biased attempt to demonstrate the unfitness of the high priests who preceded the Hasmoneans. After the accession of Antiochus IV, Jason, brother of the high priest Onias, obtained the high priesthood for himself by offering bribes to Antiochus IV, 360 talents of silver plus another 80 talents from a different source of revenue. In addition, he offered a bribe of 150 talents of silver for permission to open a gymnasium in Alexandria and enroll the citizens of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. Having received permission, Jason introduced Hellenistic customs to replace Jewish law and tradition. After 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, brother of the corrupt prostates of the temple, to deliver the annual installment of his bribe. But Menelaus outbid Jason by 300 talents of silver and so obtained the high priesthood for himself. There are tantalizing allusions to Ammanitis in this narrative. After his deposal, Jason was driven from Jerusalem and took refuge in the land of Ammon. During Antiochus' second invasion of Egypt, Jason heard a false rumor of the king's death. He recruited 1,000 armed men and attempted a bloody attack on Jerusalem, but failed, then returned back to Ammanitis. King Antiochus, hearing of Jason's attack, interpreted it as a general revolt of Judah and attacked Jerusalem, massacred its residents, and looted 1,800 talents from the temple. As for the fugitive Jason, he sought refuge with the Nabatean Arabs, but they persecuted him. He fled again, ending up temporarily in Egypt before dying unmourned. The details linking Jason with Ammanitis suggest that he was allied with Hyrcanos, and that Hyrcanos provided the troops for his failed adventure. This would provide a second motive for Antiochus' attack on Iraq al-Amir, in addition to his the perpetual conflicts between Hyrcanos and the Arabs. Hyrcanos' suicide makes better sense if we understand he was suspected of treason and faced the excruciating death reserved for traitors. Finally, the enmity between the Nabatean Arabs and Hyrcanos could explain their mistreatment of Jason after Hyrcanos was no longer alive to protect him. It's probably not coincidence that the final imitative issue of Tobiad tetradrachms differs from preceding issues, which had faithfully reproduced the titulature of their Ptolemaic prototypes. This final emission imitated tetradrachms of Ptolemy II from Ptolemais in his regnal year 32, but they substituted the royal title for the Soter legend that appeared on the prototypes. This may simply be a partisan response to Antiochus IV's claims to sovereignty over Egypt, but I'll offer a more daring hypothesis, already proposed by Eric Carlin, that the coinage of the change in legend implied a claim of Ptolemaic sovereignty over the former Ptolemaic province. If this coin issue in fact funded the attack of Jason on Jerusalem, and its titulature represents a claim of Ptolemaic sovereignty, then the attack on Jerusalem was more than a dispute over the high priesthood. It was an attempt to restore Lagid rule in the context of a presumed vacancy in the Seleukid throne. The final emission of the Tobiad mint was extremely large. 21 obverse dies have now been identified. If these dies were used to their full capacity, assuming an average output of 20,000 coins per die, Their output would have totaled 280 talents. This would be enough to pay a troop of 1,000 infantry for 56 weeks, or a troop of 1,000 cavalry for 28 weeks. Even recognizing the many limitations of these kinds of estimates, this large emission should have been sufficient to finance both Jason's assault on Jerusalem and an anticipated occupation of the city. The alliance between Jason and Hyrcanos did not begin in 168, since Jason already took refuge in Ammanitis after his deposal from the high priesthood. We may even suspect that Hyrcanos advanced part of the funds offered by Jason to Antiochus IV, which explicitly came from at least 2 different sources of revenue. If this was the case, did Hyrcanos' support for Jason involve a personal desire to establish Hellenizing reforms in Jerusalem? According to some, Joseph, son of Tobias, and Hyrcanos were Hellenizers because they dined at the table of the Ptolemaic king. This certainly implies courtly manners and perhaps a certain laxness toward Judahite dietary law, but it's a leap to infer a personal desire to overthrow national tradition and identity. I would envision instead a Ptolemaic policy aimed at seducing Antiochus IV into actions that would alienate a significant segment of his Judahite subjects. Diodorus informs us that Linnaeus and Euleus, ministers of the young Ptolemy VI, stockpiled gold, silver, and other riches in the treasury in advance of their attempted invasion of Syria, and they sent the army laden with riches in an attempt to subvert the loyalties of the Seleukid defenders. Evidently, these courtiers, who managed the kingdom, considered bribery to be an effective tool of statecraft. We might hypothesize then that they authorized the bribery of the king by Jason and provided some or all of the funding advanced by Hyrcanos. But this hypothesis depends on the historicity of Second Maccabees, of the account in Second Maccabees. And if we prefer the versions in Josephus, which has Menelaus as the founder of the gymnasium, all of these thoughts are moot. In 2022, a small silver hoard was discovered in official excavations at Wadi el Marabat, east of Bethlehem, in Cave 2, overlooking the Dead Sea. The hoard contained 15 Ptolemaic tetradrachms, mostly in mint state. They were concealed at the bottom of a wooden pyxis below a layer of stuffing that included a scrap of purple wool. The majority of the coins, 9 of the 15, were era tetradrachms of the second phase. They range in date from era year 87, equivalent to 176.5 BCE, to era year 92, equivalent to 171.70 BCE. This is a tight sequence of dates and provides a closing date for the hoard. The remainder of the hoard consisted of a tetradrachm of Kition, dated to year 6 of the first reign of Ptolemy VI, that is 176.5, 2 imitations of the Tobiad mint, whose date of issue is estimated around 175.4, and 3 Alexandrian tetradrachms of the large undated issue of Ptolemy VI. The date of this Alexandrian issue is debated, but a few specimens were included in the Jordan 2016 hoard, proving that their production began in or shortly before 174.3. The bulk of this issue was, in my opinion, struck by 170 to finance the ill-fated Ptolemaic invasion of Syria. In any case, the specimens in the Wadi Marabat hoard should probably not be later than the securely dated closing coins. The caves of the eastern desert were places of refuge during troubled times. They were the sources of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Shimon bar Kokhba, leader of the Judean revolt against Hadrian 132 to 135 CE, used the cave as his headquarters. The new hoard is the first evidence that these caves also served as places of refuge during the troubles of the early 160s. The use of a purple cloth to cover the coins is an indication of the elite status of their owner, but it also shows he did not belong to the very highest level of the Hellenistic elite. Analysis of the textiles revealed that the purple used was not the prestigious murex purple, but some unidentified substitute. The date of the hoard points to a connection with the troubles in Jerusalem during the Sixth Syrian War. The hoard coins are of the type we would expect to find in the hands of a Ptolemaic partisan who received money from Joseph, son of Tobias, and or Hyrcanos. The hoard does not include older Ptolemaic coins, such as are found in other hoards from the late 170s. And this argues that it does not simply represent currency in circulation. Judging from the dates of the hoard coins, it appears that the Tobiads may have begun at some point in the mid-170s to mobilize their assets to support an eventual Ptolemaic intervention. The authors of the official publication of the hoard, Eitan Klein, Gabriela Bijavsky, and many others, related its loss to the violent events in Jerusalem during the Sixth Syrian War or in the early years of the Maccabean revolt. I prefer the earlier context because of the Tobiad associations of so many of the hoard coins. Significant events of Judahite were against the background of abnormal monetary patterns. Physical evidence shows that silver coinage was drained from the Seleukid province of Syria and Phoenicia in the first decades of the 2nd century. Tobiad tax farming on behalf of Ptolemy V and VI is a plausible explanation for the disappearance of silver coinage by 170. Over the same period, silver coinage accumulated in Ammanitis, presumably as profits from the tax farming. And the Tobiads even operated a private silver mint to finance some of their activities. These facts strongly suggest that the Tobiads were the wealthiest players in the Judahite sphere in the first decades of the 2nd century. The role of the Tobiads in undermining Seleukid rule in Judah is open to interpretation. A minimal interpretation is that their success as Ptolemaic tax farmers inspired a certain portion of the Judahite population to favor the Ptolemaic kings, while the rift in the family fomented discord and encouraged a furious rivalry between Jason and Menelaus over the high priesthood. A maximal interpretation builds on the close ties of Joseph, son of Tobias, and Hyrcanos with the court at Alexandria. Joseph and Hyrcanos must have known of the Ptolemaic goal of recovering the lost province, already bruited toward the end of the reign of Ptolemy V. After the death of Cleopatra I, or the murder of Seleucus IV, they began preparing to support an eventual intervention. This may perhaps be related to the change in management of the era coinage in 170-76. In or shortly before 175-4, the Tobiad mint in Ammanitis produced a major issue of tetradrachms, which required 16 obverse dies, roughly a quarter of all those used in the 2nd century. The otherwise inexplicable hoard loss in the early years of Antiochus IV suggests that the Seleukid king was aware of Tobiad intentions and attempted to disrupt them, perhaps through his Arab allies. Finally, the changed legend of the last issue of the Tobiad mint announced claims of Ptolemaic sovereignty. We've already considered a scenario in which Hyrcanos promoted Ptolemaic interests by facilitating Jason's bribery of Antiochus IV and the introduction of socially divisive Greek institutions. And later, in the belief that Antiochus IV had died, financed the rebellion to restore Ptolemaic sovereignty. Because of the contradictions in the literary sources, we can't be sure of this reconstruction of events. But the wealth of the Tobiads and their role as agents of the Ptolemaic state leave little doubt that they were to some degree responsible for the tragic events in Jerusalem during the Sixth Syrian War. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for your fascinating talk. Now we are looking forward to the response by Ben Scolnic. And as the co-host, he does not need much of an introduction, but I would like to point out that besides being a devout rabbi, biblical scholar, and also Seleukid scholar, Ben has a sustained track record of investigating the priestly families of the ancient Judeans, especially in the Hellenistic period, but also beyond, including also the family history of the Tobiads. And some of his recent research has been exploring particularly the involvement of the Tobiads in the conflict surrounding the conflict of the early 160s, but also the conflicts around the Fifth Syrian War and the conquest of Jerusalem in this very context. So Ben is in a very good position to respond to Kathy, and I'm very curious to hear what your take on the matter is, Ben.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Yes.
Yes, but it is a little cut. I don't see the. Oh, now it's complete. Good.
Okay. So Kathy, first of all, I want to thank you. That was an incredible lecture. I've read your full-length manuscript, and I have to tell you that I've rarely been so stimulated by anything. And I want to tell you that I'm going to do what I want to do in about 10 minutes, but I could speak for 3 hours. And I want to tell you, I want to do the first hour in about a minute. I'm not going to do the third hour at all. The third hour is what happened after all this, the implications. You have a sentence in your script that you didn't mention now about what the reaction might have been to Hyrcanus and to everything he did. A sentence that sent me to the skies because it dovetails with all sorts of things about Tobians and a connection to Judas Maccabeus, and there are all sorts of things, but I'm not going to talk about that. Instead, what I want to hone in on chronology. And you're not going to accept, I don't think, what I'm going to suggest, but I'd like to try anyway in the spirit of collegiality. I'm assuming that everything that you're saying about numismatics is correct. I'm just going to play with the chronology a little bit. But first, I want to just show you that very quickly. You have a sentence at the very beginning. As is well known, the Tobiads controlled ancestral lands in the Ammanitis. So I want to say that I want to talk about the Tobiads as a kind of quasi-royalty. I want to give some little historical background before everything that you're talking about. For all the might of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, they were Johnny-come-latelys compared to the Tobiads. A different approach to these empires looks not from the top down, as we all do, but from the middle up and down. For at times they controlled their areas, and at times they were seen as local elites. The Tobiads were negotiating relationships with the Assyrians and the Arameans when the Macedonians were just beginning to rule. Most scholars see the Tobiads as a minor chapter in the histories of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, but we can also see the Seleucids and the Ptolemies as a chapter in the history of the Tobiads. So I give you an alternative title to your paper, Tobiad Economic Power and its Relationship to the Ptolemies and the High Priests of Judah.
Okay.
Okay. So in other words, you could, I'm just trying to give a very different perspective. Okay. Very quickly, this is this whole first hour in one slide. In the 11th century, there was a land called Tob, and we have this in the Bible. In the 10th century, we have King David conquering from the Ammanites. When we talk about the Ammanites and the Ammonites, Amman in Jordan today, it's all the same thing. So in the 900s, King David conquered that land. And there was a family, the Tobiads, named for that land of Tob, and they were so entrenched and so powerful that by 732, they were trying to place one of their own on the throne of Judah with the help of the Arameans and the Israelis. In other words, these were rivals to the Davidite dynasty. The Tobiads survived the fall and exile of the kingdom of Israel in 721. They still owned and could sell land under the Assyrians in the 7th century and the 600s. They were either never exiled or returned from Babylonian exile in the 6th century. Tobiah was allied with Sanballat against Nehemiah. So when I say there's a different perspective, time is on my side in looking at it this way.
Yeah.
So the Tobiads not only survived for all these centuries, but flourished through all the empires and kingdoms for a millennium. We see a rivalry between the Davidite dynasty of kings and the powerful Tobiads in the 8th century. This powerful clan would at various points challenge whoever was in control in Jerusalem, whether it was kings from the Davidite dynasty, the Persian appointee Nehemiah, or in the Hellenistic period, as you illustrate, when the Tobiads became powerful tax farmers who were involved with temple politics and the United High Priests. Okay, that's the whole first hour in two minutes. Now I want to hone in. What was the timing of the attack of Antiochus IV and the suicide of Hyrcanus? You say that correctly that Josephus can give the impression that these events occurred very early in the reign of Antiochus IV, which would be 174. But if I'm understanding you, you'd wrestled with that for a while, and now I'm moving it a few years later. Yes. And here's a footnote where you were struggling with this and being very open. You're saying you can't reconcile this with that, and I think that struggle was the proper one, and I think you come to the right place, or at least very close to where I think is the right place. Mm-hmm. So now you can correct me if I'm wrong, but here's the chronology that I am deriving from you. That 193 is the dowry of Cleopatra, and that Joseph becomes the collector of Ptolemaic taxes. That he farmed taxes for 22 years. Again, this is what I think I'm understanding from your paper. And that 22 years, which is one of the things I want to hone in on, is 193 to 172. Yes. And I think that you've now said 174 is not when he commits suicide, but then I think you're assuming that Joseph is dying in 172. And I think the reason you come to this...
Joseph might die a little later than that. I mean, it's not entirely clear, but
okay. So let me try. But so just to back that up, but 174 is before Joseph dies. And at this point, if 174 is before Joseph dies, Jason is high priest, and Antiochus IV is not in the region. Antiochus is just beginning to acquire power in 174, and he may have benefited from Hyrcanus paid Jason bribes, as you illustrate very well. Why would Hyrcanus commit suicide in 174? Right? There's no threat to him. There's nothing going on that would make him do this. That's why I think you're right in moving it a little bit later. Okay, so here's a slightly revised chronology that I want to propose, and there's going to be a couple of radical things in here that I don't expect anybody to accept, but I want to try anyway. 186 is a date that you give, and I think it's a fixed date. As you say, Ptolemy VI is born in May, June 186. He's the heir, and people are going to visit. I think that's a fixed date that we can play from, and I think that's what you do. Okay. I'm going to suggest, going back and forth from that, something that Joseph began to control the taxes earlier, and I'm going to it's going to be based on, if you'll give me a few minutes, the 22 years that we talk about. I'm just going to list it, and then I'm going to try to prove it. In 182, I'm going to suggest that Joseph dies after 22, and I'm going to explain why, or 36 years in his position. The brothers struggle. Hyrcanus goes to the Ammanitis for the last 7 years of Seleukid IV's reign, but also after this. That will not be the end of Hyrcanus in the Ammanitis. Josephus's language there is a little vague. In September 175, Seleukid IV is assassinated. Antiochus IV takes control, And Hyrcanos, the ally and cousin, I want to make a big point about this, because you're talking a lot about their relationship. We can give that genealogically. Okay, we know that Joseph's mother was a sister of the high priest Onias II. Let me try to say that a little bit better, right? Onias the second had a sister, and she married Tobias. Tobias had Joseph, who had Hyrcanus. So these are cousins. That is, Joseph was a first cousin of the high priest Simon. These are not only, when I say quasi-royalty, I really mean it. I mean,
Yes.
these are nobility, but nobility in this case not having to do with kings, but having to do with the high priestly family. And they're all intermarried. So Hyrcanus and Jason were, as you say, allies, but they were also close cousins. So I think that just gives more force to everything you were saying.
Yes,
In 172, Jason is deposed, and he goes to Hyrcanus. Of course he goes to Hyrcanus. They're allies and friends. But again, why would Hyrcanus commit suicide in 174, as Josephus gives the impression about? There'd be no reason to. He's riding high. His ally and cousin has just taken over the high priesthood, and as you say, probably with his money, right? Why would he commit suicide at that point? You must be right. In 168, and I know people are going to be a little unhappy with this, Jason attacks Jerusalem. He runs back to Hyrcanus and then to his death, and Hyrcanus commits suicide. Now, I want to try to back some of this up. And it has to do with Joseph's life. I'm going to try to make the radical suggestion that the mess, as you say, that Josephus is about this, placing, and that's why some people will place all of the Tobiad romance in the 3rd century and some in the 2nd century. And Altay said at the very beginning, you place it squarely in the 2nd century. I want to place it in both. I think Josephus is a jumble, and that 22 years is going to be very important. Here is Josephus is a young man in the time of Onias II. There was now Joseph, young in age, but of great reputation. His father's name was Tobias, and here's what I was saying. His mother was the sister of Onias, the high priest. So he's a young man, and they keep emphasizing how he's a young man. Down at the bottom of this passage, he's a young man. And so he's given authority by Ptolemy the III. If it's Ptolemy the III, we're talking about the 3rd century, not the 2nd century, right? Okay, so what I'm trying to suggest, and I'm hoping to do this, is that Joseph was already a tax farmer in the 3rd century on into the 2nd century, renewed by that when the dowry was given to Cleopatra. Okay, now in 186, Joseph is an old man. He's such an old man that he can't go to Alexandria for the birthday celebration of the heir. That's why Hyrcanus goes. The reason that Hyrcanus goes to Egypt is because Joseph is near the end of his life. Now, if he was a young man in 193, he wouldn't be an old man in 186.
Yes.
Okay, so Hyrcanus is only going there and has this opportunity. So if Joseph is an old man in 186, I think this backs the case that he was already a tax farmer in the 3rd century. Now, according to Josephus, Joseph held the position for 22 years, but there's a manuscript that has it as 36 years. And I don't know what this means. Maybe somebody here can help me. Here's the note that I'm taking from Riston. 36 years in one manuscript, which is perhaps the true number. And I don't know what PRID period means. Maybe somebody can help me. But isn't that interesting that there is a manuscript that has 36 years, which puts us further back? But yes. Hold on. I want to talk a little bit more about that. So 22 years is mentioned, as you said, twice for the length of Joseph's tenure. It's a really complicated data point. Joseph died after 187. How do we know? Because we know that Seleukid IV became king then. And after 186, 185, when Ptolemy VI is born, because he's still an old man in 186, he's not dead yet, as Monty Python would say. If he died in 182, and I'm just using this as a number, this takes us back to 204, right? or if it's the 36 years, to 218. It would mean that Joseph was a tax farmer under the Ptolemy before the 5th Syrian War and continues, through the Cleopatra Syria dowry. The story starts with Joseph as a young man and dies an old man in his position for either 22 or 36 years. Both 22 and 36 take us back to full Ptolemaic control. So here's something that you said. This mint surely operated on a Tobiad authority. It may have struck its first coinage during the 4th Syrian War. Bingo, right? The 4th Syrian War takes us back to like 219 to 217, if I'm remembering correctly. So what if you're exactly right that coinage is showing that the Tobiads were already striking coinage during the 4th Syrian War, which makes my case that Joseph's already the tax farmer way back then. If so, does this not show a Tobiad Ptolemaic mint way before the starting date for Joseph in 193? What if the 36 years of the manuscript is right, and it's 182 plus 36 equals 218 in the 4th Syrian War, 219 to 217? What if a lot of the apparent confusion in Josephus, which has been driving everybody crazy for a century, is because this story takes place in both the 3rd and 2nd centuries? What if it's a jumble because it was a jumble because there was this continuum and Josephus didn't completely understand? What if, and maybe I'm not understanding what you meant by second phase era coinage, but if that's the second phase era, what if there was a first era set of coinage before it?
There was.
Okay, so
it wasn't minted on Cyprus.
Oh, good. Okay, so Hyrcanus lives beyond Joseph's death, and I don't think I need to go into that. Okay, so all we have to do is rearrange Josephus's passages a little bit. Okay, and he gives the impression that Hyrcanus committed suicide before the events in Jerusalem, which doesn't make much sense. All you have to do is rearrange, and I do it here, and say, and Hyrcanus ruled over those parts of the Ammanites for 7 years, during all the time the Seleucids ruled over Asia, and I would say, and beyond. But when this king died, his brother Antiochus occupied the throne, and what the 236, this bottom passage, is what follows from that. I think they're just finishing the Tobiad romance, or he's just finishing the story, and so he gives the impression that Hyrcanus committed suicide before the events of whether you want to say 169 or 168, when actually it wasn't. I think that just happened. I think he's dealing with different manuscripts or sources or something, and he's just finishing the story about the Tobiads before he goes to tell the story in Jerusalem. But if you just take that one sentence about Hyrcanus, about his suicide, out, move it just a tiny bit till after the events of Jerusalem, I think it works much better and suits your purposes much better. Hold on, try to go down. Good. Okay. So I'm just trying to slightly revise the chronology. You've argued that the attack of Antiochus IV occurred between the two Egyptian invasions, but how does this leave Jason and the Ammanites for his attack in 168? What if, and I think that you're saying this, I'm just not sure, what if the attack was retribution against the supporters of Jason immediately after the second invasion, 168? So to pin it down, from 172, I say 172, that's when Menelaus took over from Jason. That's when he went to his cousin Hyrcanus. And you have a couple of coins still in 171. So they're there together, and they're cooling their heels. They're biding their time, looking for an opportunity to gain control back from Menelaus. 168, as you say, is the day of Eleusis. I think I'm sorry, Jason's attack on Jerusalem was because of that false rumor that you talked about. Antiochus attacks, Jason flees, and Hyrcanus kills himself at that point. So, okay, and I'm not going to go into this, but I'm just going to say thank you, Kathy, for all your great work. But I do want to say that your implications for what happens after that are just remarkable. Anyway, I want to thank you for everything.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I want to let you know that Fauzi Zayadin has also proposed a scenario similar to the one that you did, that Joseph began being a Ptolemaic tax farmer under Ptolemy III and continued into the 2nd century.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this article, or?
No, I'm not, but I'll look at it right after this.
Well, I can probably send it to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, I assume that, Kathy, would you like to say a little bit more, or normally we give the speaker and the respondent a little extra time to have their exchange before we open the discussion to the floor. I'm absolutely sure that there will be uncountable questions, but first you have the privilege to say a little more if you want to, Kathy.
I don't think I have anything else more to say about this, but
Well, then I thank both of you again. And well, what Ben did was at least in some part answering to one of the urgent questions that I have. It seems obvious to me that Josephus is conflating two different traditions. And what I found so strong in Kathy's approach, and I still find very strong, and I'm not yet sure how to juggle it and how to balance it with what Ben has suggested, is the 22 years, how well they fit into the early second century, and that combined with the gradual withdrawal of the silver coinage, that seems very strong to me. But as we have seen, that Kathy's new perspective have started a lot of thinking and will continue doing so.
well, let me just say that, Ben's reconstruction, which has Hyrcanos succeed Joseph, son of Tobias, as the Ptolemaic tax collector, is still consistent with the physical evidence. I mean, as long as the taxes were being collected, it doesn't matter whether it's the father or the son doing it. Right.
Mm-hmm. So then perhaps may I direct the discussion into a slightly different direction, and it's a much more basic question that I'd like to start with. I still have problems imagining how the agreement about the division of the taxes should have worked in practice. We have indications here on the one side that there was Seleukid control. We have indications on the other hand that there was tax farming, well, authorized by Ptolemy and conducted by Joseph. But all these texts only seem to present us with a version or with a context in which Joseph was working for Ptolemy and not for any Seleukid king. So there is the question of authority. How should we imagine cooperation or acceptance of the fact that the Seleucids were the effective rulers? And second, how would the Seleukid king, starting with Antiochos III, have received his share? In which shape, if as you say, the money was collected in Ptolemaic silver coinage, whether it was collected this way or whether the wealth that was accumulated was then reissued in Tobiad coinage in the Ammanitis. But can you elucidate that problem a little bit more for me?
Well, first of all, I don't think we have any evidence, so we can only speculate what was going on. I would assume that the Seleukid king had his own tax collectors, and they collected his taxes, whether he took Ptolemaic money and then somehow found a way to change it to Attic standard silver, I don't know. At one point, I thought maybe Seleukid taxes were only collected in kind, but there's really no basis for believing that. The Phoenician cities were industrial commercial centers, and money was what they did. So I would expect that the Seleukid king also received money taxes.
But then in the more traditional way of dealing with elite, that they would take care of it and then collecting it just in the way as Heliodorus came to the Temple of Jerusalem and put forward his claims to the high priest, and in such a way, you mean, so that dealings were on that higher level from both sides, that they did not conflict at the lower levels. Would that be a proper understanding of your suggestion?
Yes, I think that's my suggestion, that the Tobiads only served the Ptolemaic kings in collecting their taxes, and the Seleukid half of the taxes were managed otherwise. But as I said in my lecture, we really don't understand how this province was administered. I mean, it was such a strange decision to leave all that Ptolemaic coinage there and not do anything about it. I honestly believe that Antiochus III may have been so wrapped up in military campaigns and planning for the next campaign and so forth that he didn't think very realistically about administrative problems on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so far. Any other questions or comments? Please raise your hand. Ideally, you use the reaction button for that, because I do not see all your screens on my little screen. But I would. Okay, Eric Carlin, please. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yes. Okay. There is Kay and Amity have written some work on discussing how this tax farming may have worked.
Yes.
And one of the proposals there is that the Seleucids collected taxes on transportation on ships coming in and out of ports on the coast, where they kept control, and that the tax farming of the Tobiads was in the hinterland. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of how this would fit in, and why such a tax farming agreement would be advantageous to Antiochus III, who had a war with Rome coming up on the horizon and had an expensive dowry to commit, and this tax, handing over the tax revenues, was a way to keep all of the silver in the Seleukid treasury for imminent needs, while giving an extravagant dowry at the same time. And so there's literature on that. In addition, there was a question about the first phase of the uncertain era coinage. And indeed, there was another practically unbroken series from an undated issue, year 48, on up through year 55, with only year 53 unknown as present. And a curious thing about this is that in the intervening years, the Fifth Syrian War took place, and Ptolemy V coined silver in many mints, Tripolis, Bertis, Biblios, that had not coined anything before, yet the area coinage was not revived at all during the war. It stayed silent and emerged exactly at the end of the Fifth Syrian War in a period of peace. And again, for an extreme unusual thing, continued for exactly these 22 years after the Fifth Syrian War, up until the time when Ptolemy VI reasserted sovereignty over the dowry range. So there's an interesting, this coinage seems to be related to something other than military events per se. And indeed, the 22 years that are discussed, that's a figure that that refers to the time between the end of the Fifth Syrian War, other than the dowry period, and the beginning of the Sixth Syrian War. But indeed, when the Ptolemies controlled the area before they lost it in the Fifth Syrian War, undoubtedly they would have been collecting taxes and doing some sort of tax farming themselves. This is entirely consistent with the idea that the Tobiads were doing something before it. And if there are 36 years, those would probably include some time before the Fifth Syrian War. And that's not at all inconsistent with anything about, I mean, the problem for numismatists, I think, is to explain why was there all this Ptolemaic coinage during the 22 years after the Fifth Syrian War and before the Sixth. But if the tax farming was going on before that, that seems all very likely. I mean, the Ptolemies were very efficient at wringing as much tax as possible from all of their empire. It's okay. So these were the comments I wanted to make. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thank you for reminding me about Kai and Amitai's article. I think I need to reread it because it will probably shed light on the questions that you just discussed. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. And Christelle, next.
Thank you, Kathy, for this amazing talk. As always, it's so rich. I'm still processing all what you have said. I have two probably naive questions. What's about this imitative coinage of the Tobiad? And I wanted to, ask a little bit more. What's the deal there? I mean, how is that? What sort of deal there is with the Ptolemies? How is that authorized or advantageous and so on? And my other questions is completely different about the attack in Jerusalem. You mentioned that it's when with some people there is this rumor of the death of Antiochos IV. So to what extent you think were you implying that the Ptolemies were spreading this kind of rumor, hoping for this kind of events to happen in their advantage? So these are completely different questions. Sorry.
Yes. Well, I'll respond to the second question first because I think it's easier to deal with. I hadn't had that thought that the Ptolemies were spreading that rumor, but it's a perfectly good thought. And I've also mentioned to Ben on this subject that it's amazing that Ptolemy VI came out with such a high reputation among Jews after all of these shenanigans that caused so much trouble in Judah and cost so many lives. You would think that he'd be a hated figure, and I suppose that it was just convenient that all the Tobiads that were responsible were dead by then, so they could take the blame. Yeah, but anyway, what exactly is the question about the imitative Tobiad mint?
I mean, how is that authorized? I mean, and how is that advantageous? And
I don't know whether it was authorized or not. We have no evidence, written evidence to help us understand that. All we have are the find spots of the coins. They're very much concentrated in Jordan and eastern Judah. So it's hard not to believe that they were made there. But whether the Tobiads needed any authorization to operate their own mint, I don't know. I mean, as Rabbi Ben pointed out, they were quasi-royalty that went back a long ways.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Oliver, please.
Hi, Kathy. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I have a question for you. What was circulation of Ptolemaic silver like in Jordan before the Tobiad mint? I'm curious because I'm wondering if the Tobiad operations have anything to do with the Nabatean adoption of Ptolemaic types, probably after in the 170s maybe.
Well, first of all, we have the Iraq al-Amir hoard from the mid-3rd century, which is the largest silver coin hoard from the Syro-Phoenician region. So do you have Egyptian hoards 1? So you can see what was in it?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So, generally a good representation of all kinds of Ptolemaic coinage that had been issued in the region, and I believe some from outside too, but I don't actually remember now. But so that was what was circulating there before the Tobiad mint opened. As for Nabatean coin types of the 170s? I would need to think about that a little bit, but it's perfectly imaginable that since they were living in a region where the only coinage circulating was Ptolemaic, they would have been influenced by it rather than by Seleukid coinage.
Yeah. No, I just find it interesting that it's around the same time that the Tobiads start minting that the Nabateans start to pick it up too.
Yeah.
They don't do it earlier. And it seems an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, so you're referring to bronze coinage, Nabatean bronze coinage of around the Fourth Syrian War period, right?
No, I'm talking about that very rare dram of Obodas that it looks like it's modeling itself partially on a Ptolemy the Fifth types with the the wheat in the diadem.
Okay, I'm out of my depth here. I don't know Nabatean coinage well enough to respond. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. And Julian comes next.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I learned a lot about Judea in this time period, and I do think it's very interesting and very plausible that the Ptolemies would try to influence things in Seleucid Judea in this way. So now I also have a question which will maybe sound a bit challenging, but we had a talk here at our university in Germany yesterday by Reinhard Kratz. I don't know if you're familiar with the name. He's a German historian of ancient Judaism and a theologist, and he has basically revised also in a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran, which he really published last year. He basically revised the whole chronology of the Maccabean revolt, and basically to shortly summarize it, some of it obviously fits what you've said, and some of it is obviously very, very much rejecting older research, because he thinks that the Torah of Moses as the Jewish law, as the Pentateuch, that it was not really followed by most people in Judea in this period, that only the Hasmoneans really promoted it as the law for all of Judea. And of course, that would also change your interpretations in this regard. And I can only recapitulate what he said yesterday, because it's not an expert on this topic, and it was all kind of new to me, but he basically thinks that the Hasmoneans, they made it their law so that they could legitimate later taking the position of high priest and king from the families such as the Tobiads and the Oniads, and therefore that in the biblical tradition they also justified their behavior in hindsight, so that Antiochos may not have plundered the temple like that or forbidden the Judaic religion, but that this is a later exaggeration. So I just wanted to point this out, that this theory is out there now, and this revisionary approach. I think the book was published in German in 2022, but that's probably something in English, because he's often in the US and North America as well. And I only really wanted to bring this to your attention, because I'm not really an expert on this myself.
Thank you. Sylvie Honigman has also emphasized that we have to be very skeptical about many things in Jewish literature, because they're driven by a purpose.
Katz really said several times that he's basing his research on Honigman and just developing it further.
Yeah.
Thank you. And next, Alain, please.
Well, it's a fascinating talk. I have just a little short suggestion, or what you said about the arrival of Ptolemaic coins, which do not arrive after 200 BCE in Judah. I'm just wondering whether, well, I'm not sure they prevented the import of coins, or maybe, as it was suggested by Eric Carlin, if there was a kind of filter by the Seleucids on the coast, they may have arrived, but they were not accepted as such. I mean, they may have been reminted one way or other. I'm not sure that they would have refused, let's say, in the ancient world, they would have refused good silver one way or other. And probably is a kind of monetary policy on behalf of the Seleucids that, well, it would be a suggestion at least that I would make to your talk. But thanks again also to Ben for your fascinating dialogue also, which I much appreciated.
No, thank you for that suggestion. It's a very interesting one. Obviously, I only know the physical evidence, and we can only speculate about how things ended up that way. But that's a very good idea.
Okay, we have some time for more questions, but while you are thinking about yours, I just take the next from my long list. Kathy, I'm not sure whether you mentioned it today or whether it's from my reading of your 2019 Electrum article. I am thinking about the amount that Joseph allegedly offered Ptolemy as a bribery, or the price he offered in the auction of the tax farming. 16,000, or he's said to have doubled the 8,000 that all the other tax farmers combined offered, which was 8,000, so resulting in 16,000. That's the figure that Josephus gives us. And you are trying to defend this figure, which I found astoundingly high. Also, in light of all the comparative data that Alain discussed for us last month, of course, it comes to mind that the war indemnities for the Romans was around 15,000 talents altogether. So the annual amount, whether it's 8 or 16,000 for Phoenicia and Coile Syria combined, just seems mind.
As I recall, when I tried to defend that figure, I said it was
beginning of
a one-time bid to sort of squelch the whole matter. And I did not assume that he bid the same amount in following years. Because
right.
If we accept what Josephus tells us, his collection of the taxes was abusive. And, he went to the Ascalon and murdered leading citizens and expropriated all of their possessions. And it did the same thing up in Bet-Shean, was it? Scythopolis. So if we believe that detail, it would have only been one time.
Mm-hmm. But even that would be so crippling. Now, I'm wondering, because a few chapters before there is talk of 20 talents that Onias was owing, and I understand these 20 talents as the tax debt from Jerusalem, or let's say largely from Judea, to be delivered by or coming from the high priest. 20 talents. And even if we say that Phoenicia is so much wealthier, but the question is, if that is a reasonable expectation for 1 year from Jerusalem, how could we go as a reasonable expectation? How far could we go from there? And so I wonder then if the figures of 2 Maccabees, the figures that specify the bribery of the high priest for first of Jason and then of Menelaos to take over the high priest position, whether that figure can also help us interpret the whole other figures, because that's the last figure that I remember is that Menelaos offered 300 talents more than Jason had offered. So we are in the higher hundreds. I have forgotten what the total is. You may remember. But that would be coming from Judea, from Jerusalem alone. And comparing that with the 20 on the one hand and with the 8 or 6,000 on the other.
Is it coming from Judean taxes, or is it coming from the Tobiads?
Well, that's a good question. But so the thing is that Joseph is presented to us as a poor man, and now Ben comes and says, "Well, that's not true. He cannot have been a poor man." But he is presented as a have-not. He is incurring debts everywhere, and so everything he is offering is actually coming from what he is farming and extorting, and he does not have, or is not said to have had a family property to draw on for that reason. But well, my question was, I was trying to put these figures into context, whether they might help us to get a better understanding, or whether you would now still think it's plausible, the numbers as a one-time payment are still plausible, or whether you think that this is much more a novelistic element, and well, heavily exaggerates the financial capacities of the whole region, no matter whether it's more private, more the temple income or regular tax income.
It's probably a novelistic detail.
Mm-hmm.
But to come back to something you said earlier, do bear in mind that Judah was a poor, impoverished region. Really not very well off at all, and in no way comparable to the wealthy coast and all the Phoenician cities. I mean, I don't think we have any basis for saying that the Phoenician coast was 16 times wealthier than Judah, or 20 times or 10 times, but it was definitely, an important commercial center of the ancient world. And Judah was a backwater.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. So, are there further questions or suggestions? If there are not, then, well, not for now, then I can say I am very pleased that Kathy has offered her presentation to one of our forthcoming volumes, which will probably be Seleukid Perspectives number 3, Jewish Responses to Seleukid Rule. And I'm sure that the discussion and the mutual learning will continue in the process of finalizing this paper, a process that I'm looking forward to very much. So thank you, Kathy, once again for your splendid presentation, and Ben also for the very stimulating feedback you have presented. And the last duty that I have today is announcing our next and upcoming lecture by our colleague Marion Meyer from Vienna. She will talk on a statue in early Hellenistic Antioch and its long life in the city and modern scholarship. And this next lecture will be on Wednesday, the 21st of February. Once again, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thanks to all of you again, and have a great rest of the day and the week.